Thank you for having invited me. I'm very pleased to be here. I come directly from a family visit in Serbia, which was formerly part of Hungary, and also went to Slovakia. So my husband left Hungary in '56, and his father actually was much older than his mother, and he was here as a recruit in the Teresianum. He then became a general in Hungary in the Second World War, and the state police tortured him and he died in '61. He never wanted to leave Hungary. He could have left in '56, but he stayed. And, well, he was a monarchist, proponent of the monarchy, and he then chose the Hungarian nationality. Now, it is great for me to be here today, and another reason is that I'm also highly interested in strategy. I'm a professor at the staff school in Oslo, Command and Staff College in Oslo, and one of our sons is in the cavalry and he's now engaged in war studies at the King's College in Cambridge. Another daughter is a military lawyer with the Ministry of Defense. Second daughter, our third child, is with the Foreigners Police. She works in the area of migration and diplomacy. And the fourth child is normal, a civilian. So actually just he and my kids don't have security clearance and cannot be informed about these things when we discuss it over lunch. We have to go outside when we discuss sensitive stuff. Anyway, now I'll continue in English because I don't have the strategic vocabulary in German. But anyway, maybe we can ask questions in German after I finish my presentation.
It's going to be about the demands of strategic leadership, not the demand for strategic leadership, because that's obvious for everybody to see. There's a need for strategic leadership in Europe. But what does that mean? What are the demands made on a strategic leader? And this is an important topic. It has to do with military culture, with an ability to think strategically and, above all, to act strategically. As you know, Clausewitz said very many things about the need for strategy, the need for planning, but he also left a lot to chance, to intuition, to the decisiveness of a leader. So strategy well done is, of course, not to act according to a plan. It is to have a plan and then improvise when circumstances change. I think General Patton was advised on what to do after he came to Italy, what to do next, and he said, yes, I listen to you, and I listen to you, and I listen to you, but I will do the very opposite. So this is the art then of strategy. And let's start by sort of a little decomposition of the terms. And I start with leadership. What is leadership? And quote Norman Schwarzkopf, General Schwarzkopf, from a speech at West Point. Leadership is character and competence. And he added, it is very hard to acquire character. Character is Bildung auf Deutsch, formation of French. It is character formation, and it is acquired through practice and willpower. And this is the old program from antiquity, the cardinal virtues, the importance of fortitude or courage, audacity for the officer, but also, I think, for the strategic politician. As opposed to the vices, and the vices are very many, it's a very long list. And as we Catholics say, a little virtue does not hurt you, but vice is nice. It is always more tempting to succumb to the vices. And I think we have an American president now who has succumbed to many vices. He probably does not know what these terms are about, but his character is very flawed. And I'm not saying that to be anti-Trump, I'm saying that as an empirical statement of importance for Europe. Because it is a major problem for international politics that the American president, who is the leader, who has the most power of any individual on this globe, that he is so erratic, so capricious, so unable to understand the complexities of international affairs, and so full of himself in terms of self-belief. So I think the turbulence and the sort of selfish policies that we've seen from the US so far, that is bound to continue. And that is important to us, not because we can change it, but because Europeans have to assume responsibility for their own region, for Europe, much more than hitherto. And I think that is good. That is a very good thing, that Europeans have to grow up, not be free riders in NATO, take charge of their own region. And I think we can just remember that the combined defense budgets of Germany, France and Britain will outdo the Russian budget in terms of what we have. Perhaps not in terms of audacity, risk willingness, forward-leaning, strategic thinking. I think Putin is far ahead in those fields, from at least compared to many Europeans. But in terms of the hardware, the ability to do something, Europeans are able to do much more than they do today with current budgets, and they ought to do much more by spending more. I just looked at the iPhone. I must admit, I looked at the iPhone when somebody else was speaking here, and President Trump has sent a letter to our Prime Minister Solberg, just published today, where it says, you lack a credible plan of spending 2%. As the only Russian neighbor of Russia in NATO, you ought to know better, sort of implied, but you lack a credible plan. I expect a strong recommitment from Norway in the Brussels summit, 2 weeks. And we cannot accept, we Americans cannot accept that some countries fail to meet their pledges, because we all pledge 2%, we Europeans. So this criticism from Trump is entirely correct, entirely appropriate, and it will hit Germany very hard, because Germany has even said that they will spend not 2%, but maybe 1.5% by 2025, which is, I think, diplomatically very silly to say, because one shouldn't say we will never reach 2%, as we have promised to do. So there will be a strong criticism of Germany, probably the letter has been sent, I guess, already, and of most other NATO countries, because only France, Britain, Poland, and I think Greece, something like that. Greece, of course, has statistics that are very interesting, to put it diplomatically, but they spend 2%. So here is arm twisting, as we call it, muscular liberalism, as some call it, for you. This is going to happen. The Americans are fed up with procrastination in Europe. And I think that is very good. It is going to speed up European sort of maturation. What about competence? Here we have, again, Trump is important because Article 5 is the lifeline in NATO. Without the Americans in NATO fully committed, there is no deterrence, there is no NATO, essentially. And we see that there is a type of realism called principled realism that the Americans have in their security strategy and the defense strategy that were published just some weeks ago. This is termed principled realism. The principal thing about it is that this is going to be the ideology of foreign policy. It is a realism based on American interests, on transactionalism, What do you bring to the table? What shall I bring to the table? It's like a business deal. And it is bilateral, trilateral partnerships. It is not multilateral. So we have a situation that is very, very clear for all to see, but I think many Europeans don't want to see it. The UN is completely sidelined. The UN Security Council is not sidelined, but it is a completely conflictual place for the time being. There's a shouting war between Russia, on the one hand, sometimes seconded by China, and the US on the other hand. And there are many examples of this conflict, as there are many examples of American retreat from multilateral agreements. Climate was mentioned, then there's the Iran agreement, then there's trade, and so forth. So this is entirely consistent and entirely to be expected. The US under Trump will look for common interests, the advantage of cooperation, but it's all based on strong nation states. So it's going to be based on states rather than on multilateral organizations. And this is also true in NATO. The US increasingly seeks bilateral agreements. Poland, and of course Poland wants such a special relationship. Norway has, it thinks at least, a special relationship about intelligence in the north. Britain has a special relationship, but is receiving a lot of flack from the US, a lot of criticism for the time being about lack of spending. France has a special relationship with Washington, which is not so public in a way. And I think also Washington would like a special relationship with Germany in terms of deterring Russia. So we have this situation that NATO's Article 5 exists, therefore NATO continues to exist, but it is not sort of a large body of multilateral diplomacy among 29 members. There are some alliances that matter in NATO. And we should notice that what is unlikely to happen is Article 5. And here strategy comes in. Strategy is, and I don't want to spend time defining it, I will simply say that strategy is the interaction with an enemy, adversary, competitor, unfriendly interlocutor. So strategy is about interacting with somebody who wants the worst for you, who wants the opposite of you, perhaps. It's a zero-sum interaction. It is not a win-win game, it's a zero-sum game. And strategy, therefore, is so difficult, like playing chess, and strategy is basically about the direction of war. It's about the use of military force. It's not about how to get your kid to go to bed or clean his room. It is not about social policy, although politicians love to speak about strategy about everything but military affairs. They have strategies for garbage collection or strategies for social policy, anti-drug, whatever strategy. What they mean is policy. But policy is linear. It is about a plan to achieve a goal. Strategy is interactive. So you sometimes have to be very daring, very surprising, very paradoxical. You have to use cunning, Kriegslist. You have to do all the things of realpolitik that Europeans are not used to. So I think this is where it becomes interesting for Europe ahead. It's not just a question of money, it's a question of having a strategy for what one wants. And it's about how to deal with Russia primarily, but also with other issues. Last year, I edited this book, Ukraine and Beyond. It's about Russia's foreign policy and defense interests, and it is about European response to it. And I think one can sum up the Russian foreign and security policy as a very rational endeavor. Russia is a revisionist power wanting to revise 1990 and all that, which is quite understandable. losing an empire and having a poor country, with sovereignty for Ukraine, Georgia, and all these other countries, including the Baltics, being sovereign states, entering NATO and the EU, East Central Europe becoming members of the same organizations, liberal democracy knocking on your door, so to speak. So I would say Russia wants to extend its sphere of influence and to make sure that we understand that the sphere of influence is a valid concept. We, of course, cannot accept that as liberal Democrats, because sovereignty is not something you have by virtue of power, but by virtue of legal recognition. But in the Russians' view, it is a traditional sphere of influence, great power politics. Georgia is in the sphere of influence, Ukraine, Eastern Europe, former CIS, and perhaps East Central Europe, perhaps the Baltics, who knows, perhaps Finland. And this is important to Russia because of the strategic depth interest, as is access to the high sea. 3 bases that are in Norwegian start by K: Kola, Kaliningrad, Crimea, extremely important militarily. And this is maritime strategy for you. This is something that cannot be ignored. The Kola base, of course, is the most important in the whole world. So Norway is not important to Russia, but Norway, in a scenario of conflict with the Americans, is, of course, immediately involved. Then Russia wants to replace NATO or marginalize NATO, have an all-European, meaning great power, concert again, which is old European history, by the way. And I think most importantly, to keep the regime from falling, not to have liberal democracy. And here is a great paradox, because we West Europeans tend to think that the spreading of democracy is what it's all about. It is just doing good in the world. No, that is the anathema to everybody who doesn't love liberal democracy. So this is the challenge of Russia. And it is, as I say, quite rational, given the facts. It is nothing to be surprised about, and I think we were very naive about this peddling liberal democracy around the world. It's certainly the worst thing to do, but of course, according to our values, it's what it's about. So I wrote a book that was just published now in June by the same publisher, Palgrave Macmillan, Hard Power in Hard Times, and that's about Europe, and that's the remainder of my talk. It's about my findings from this examination of strategic ability among the French, the British, and the Germans, and EU and NATO, 5 actors. And I looked at Russian revisionism, I looked at migration, mass migration. How have we handled that? Have we been able to stop it, to contain it, to deal with it? The answer to that is no. This is an ongoing drama now with Merkel, of course, and terrorism. These are 3 hard power problems of borders, of law and order, of the economy, etc. It is about the survival of states and, in a way, survival of nations, perhaps. And this book is coming out in August. I don't usually write 3 books in 2 years. It's just accumulated production. This is about Britain after Brexit, and it is interesting in this context because we study how security and defense is not very dependent on EU membership, for instance. It's dependent on willingness to use force, military culture, strategic culture, and ability to do so, having the hardware, having the structures. So risk-willing, relevant military power is what it's about. Which countries are able to deter, to scare, in a way, enough to deter? Who has a war-fighting mindset, a military strategic culture, and who has not, who does not have? So we conclude in this book that Britain's leading role in the north of Europe is going to continue. And we see that a coalition is forming around Britain in order to deter Russia. That is the Joint Expeditionary Force that is led by Britain and the Northern Group. And even neutral countries like Finland and Sweden, who are affected by Russia's vicinity, are seeking membership, are now full members of JEF, the Joint Expeditionary Force, are in the host nation program of NATO, so their territory, land, sea and air, will be used in both exercises and crisis and war. So they have a security guarantee in the case one really needs it, one could say. And this is highly interesting because Russian revisionism has spurred the need for military seriousness again in Northern Europe particularly, whereas France is the country for Maghreb, anti-terrorism, the South Africa. Now, back to strategy. What is strategy in real life? What do you have to do? And strategy, of course, in battle is on the tactical level. When it's down to the tactical level, it's tactics. On the operational level, it's operational art. On the military Generalstab or staff officer, it is military strategy. So it's about a particular situation, a particular case. There is never anything general about it. But above and beyond that, the use of force in battle, in operations, strategy is, of course, about deterrence and détente. It is about coercion, it is about containment, etc. And the word deterrent, the concept of deterrence, has returned from to the vocabulary of European politicians and NATO only very recently. And it is because of Russian posturing and testing of NATO. It's Crimea and beyond. A lot of violations of airspace in the Baltic Sea, in Finland, a lot of what we could call heavy metal diplomacy. So this is a difference between the use of force, how we use force and how Russia uses force. Russia uses it as a tool of diplomacy, Clausewitzian perhaps. And we have a situation of trying now to deter Russia in the Baltics with the tripwire enhanced forward, not operation but just presence. I think it was Germany that didn't want anything more military about the name for this ENP. It's called a presence. But there is a physical presence, and this deterrence model is called punishment. It is put some Americans, some Germans, and some French in a place where they may be killed in a skirmish or in a battle, and the big guns, the cavalry will come, the Americans will come and punish you if you try something. So that is a variant of the old Cold War model of deterrence, of course, where there was a promise or a threat of use of nuclear force in the case of the taking of Berlin or a European city. And of course the credibility of MAD, mutual assured destruction, was not very high because it was unlikely to happen, to have this deterrent reaction. So one changed to flexible response, as was mentioned here, after the Hamel report. So deterrence by tripwire is what we have. What we should have is, of course, denial, deterrence, a full military deterrent, but that would require an escalation in the Baltics that would be far beyond, in a way, the willingness of Europeans, and would be also a case for Russian reaction. So here we see again the strategic interaction, which is so difficult to manage. When you do something that will secure you, maybe you become even less secure. So the point of strategic option of deterrence, which is the key one for NATO, and in all military connections, this is what we prefer, this is what we would like, and it is aimed at influencing the beholder, the adversary, It is not to assure us. We are only assured if the opponent or enemy, or let's call him adversary, says, oh, my calculus is changing, I won't dare to do something. I won't test anything, I won't do anything. I refrain because I'm afraid of what will happen to me. The test question here is a Norwegian dialect from Trondheim, and it's pronounced "Vart du skremt nå?" And that means, that's really funny in Norwegian. It's a skit, it's a comedy where two neighbors are sort of dislike each other, and one tries to scare the other by all sorts of tricks. He puts out a gun, he puts out a trap, he puts out a little bomb, and he says, did I scare you now? These are sort of local yokels with nothing to do in the countryside. So the test question is, did I scare you now? Are you scared so you won't try anything? So if the answer to that is yes, fine, nothing happens. If the answer is not yes, all your own sort of admiration for your deterrent is a waste of brain and time. So this is the Baltic deployment, and in Ukraine after Crimea there has been very little Western engagement. The Minsk agreements really reflect military power on the ground, military power that is not recognized to be Russian, of course, like in Crimea, but the military situation on the ground really determines what can come out of such talks. This is what we call truce. This is negotiations for cessation de feu, Waffenstillstand. That is the kind of negotiation. It's not a peace negotiation or diplomacy. It is, what does it take for the guns to be silent? And they sometimes are not silent and flare up, and many people are killed, and there's a lull, and this is sort of frozen conflict, sometimes warmed up, sometimes frozen, effectively stopping Ukraine from any Western movement. So this is, in a way, the situation. The other type of strategic action in Europe, coercion, is also in play, is also being used. Coercion is to put pressure on a country, a state actor, and to go out and risk something, to say, unless you stop doing this, I will attack you. NATO, Kosovo, 99, Act Ord, the activation order. I was Deputy Foreign Minister at that time, and I remember how we called Belgrade to say that we are retracting the Kosovo verification mission, which was 2-3 days before the bombing started, because Norway had a presidency of the OSCE at the time. And only then did Milosevic and his Milutinovic and so on really understand that there was going to be an attack. Only then. So one could say that this coercive measure, the coercion represented by the ultimatum to Milosevic, failed utterly. It fails when you have to attack, of course. And once you have promised to attack, threatened to attack, and there's no effect, you have to attack. Otherwise, you lose all credibility when you coerce another time. So that is very risky, although it is used a lot by European governments and by Americans, because it is situations where something has to be done. We must put pressure. And usually we put pressure with economic means, sanctions, and not military means. But this is interesting how there's a literature on coercion, why it fails. And that has to do with dictators usually do not believe that liberal democrats, liberal democratic regimes, will follow through with a military threat. They do not believe that. The threat is not credible, therefore coercion fails. In this case, we have sanctions in place, EU, US, but they are not really passing the test of coercion because they are not well specified. What must Putin do to get rid of the sanctions? Well, retreat from Crimea. That is very unlikely. So what else should he do? We don't know, we haven't told him. So the sanctions keep on putting economic hardship on Russia, yet leads to the opposite political effect. Rally around the flag, the West is attacking us, etc., etc. It's not a good policy, but one does something. Then we have containment, Cold War strategy. Contain is more than deter. Contain is sort of keeping at bay, keeping away from influencing. And of course, communist ideology was something very different from today's situation. And the exclusion of Russia from G8, other fora and so on, is maybe punishment, but what we see now, football, World Championship, everything is forgotten. Nobody talked about containing Russia by not showing up for the football championship. So this is also a failed strategy if it was ever attempted. And the fourth category is the non-strategic policy, appeasement. And you remember München 38, Chamberlain's deal with Hitler, Chamberlain coming back to London saying, we have peace in our time. And 2 years later, Churchill reminded him, saying, you could choose between war and cowardice, and you chose cowardice and you got war. Well, that was typically Churchill, of course. He was not politically correct. But to give in to pressure, let fear decide policy. If the Russians are so unpleasant, you know, why not just give in? This is the appeasement. And I think this should be reflected on in European politics, because this is the temptation. We think like liberal Democrats. We do not like military power. We do not like threats or pressures. We do not like realpolitik. We want to live in a universe of law, sort of legal. Everything is peaceful and decided by law. So we will deny the reality of maybe the Americans under Trump, of Erdogan, who has now just gotten himself a new period, like Putin. For instance, putting all we are completely dependent on Erdogan for stopping migrants and or the Libyan thugs and bandits and smugglers. They are being paid a lot by the EU and by various countries to keep migrants from coming to Europe. But thereby one also assumes one enters into an extremely vulnerable situation, because we are now fully dependent on such types. So this is what I think should be explored a lot, because the lack of strategy is when outside events happen and you react. Reaction, to be reactive, is the opposite of being strategic. And in my book I show how it is not the Europeans who have been able to develop deterrence, coercion, and so on regarding Russia. It is the Americans. It was the Obama administration that started the sanctions and demanded that the EU follow suit. It was the Americans that also started deterrence. It's the Americans who are now in East Central Europe rotating forces. They've also moved more into Norway with more US Marines. So the Americans do the military stuff that the Europeans ought to be doing. The Europeans are saying, we can contribute, and we're not saying we are doing it. One exception is perhaps the British with the Joint Reaction Force, and I would say the French. If you want to read a strategic document, you must read the latest French Revue Stratégique from November last year, which goes into great detail on what France will do with military power given these and these and these interests and threats. So the French have a very well-developed sense of strategy. So if we look then at NATO before the NATO summit, we published a book on NATO some years ago called Risk Willingness and Military Capability. And clearly there are countries that do both, and there are many countries who do none of that. So NATO is increasingly a platform of coalitions of the willing and able, where non-NATO members can play almost a member-like role. I mentioned Finland and Sweden. Finland could not, even if it wanted to now, apply for NATO membership without risking a tremendous Russian reaction and thereby also risking that it wouldn't be admitted. I mean, why would NATO admit Finland with 1,300 kilometers border with Russia, thereby importing a problem into NATO? It would require a lot of fine-tuned strategic analysis, what to do in that case. So Finland does it indirectly. It goes around the problem by inserting itself into British defense structures, JEF, host nation in NATO, bilateral agreement with the UK, with the US, being inserted as much as possible in this Northern European kind of coalition. So this is also the case with Sweden. So this is what NATO is. Russia is a problem in NATO that preoccupies only Northern Europe. In the south, they're not interested. And we can show how France was completely uninterested in any criticism of Russia throughout the whole Hollande period until the bombing of Aleppo became a humanitarian problem, so to speak. We can show that Britain woke up a bit late after the referendum, but took the lead because the North Atlantic is important to Britain. The North Atlantic is sort of a strategic, heavy problem akin to the Cold War. Access to the North Atlantic, sea lines of communication, maritime strategy. This is what it's about, like the Cold War in that case. And this is where Britain is. So the GIUK gap is back. So we have this situation that NATO's everyday security policy deals with this problem for Northern Europe, whereas many member states are completely uninterested in this. There's no common vision. Since Clausewitz is entirely right that the use of military force is for political influence, political gains. It is not for military gains in an isolated way. Then it is not in Russia's interest to touch Article 5, of course. It would be absolutely suicidal for Russia to do that. So why not spend strategic analysis on how to gain political influence in many other ways? Military below Article 5, military, hybrid, whatever, special forces, intelligence. Just your imagination, in a way, puts limits to what's possible. So if I want to gain political influence in Europe, how do I do it? Well, there are many tools in the toolbox, and I must make sure that I don't touch this ceiling called Article 5, because that brings in the Americans. So here there is a lot that the Europeans must do themselves. The Europeans can't cry for the Americans unless it is really serious. So it's a conclusion by implication that the European states must deal with most of what's going to happen to them themselves. So this is, I think, a very interesting issue. So now one could say there's no need for Russia to divide and conquer, because there is such a completely divided EU by Visegrad, Austria, I would say Denmark, Poland, Italy on the one hand saying no to supranationality, especially regarding migration, and a weak Merkel and an inexperienced Macron saying we must have more supranationality, and the Brits leaving. So I think if one just doesn't need to be a sort of analyst to see that there will be much disagreement and little integration to follow. There will be disintegration of the EU unless one can agree to listen to countries and their voters. So in a way, for Russia, this is probably good news that this EU is so disintegrated. But NATO remains so far very strong because the Americans, through Mattis as the sort of general who keeps the emperor sane. This is like the Roman Empire, you know. All the important people are generals, cum politicians, and they keep Nero at bay in a way. But this is no offense intended, but and no analogy, of course, to Trump. But you get the picture. Mattis, as long as he is not sacked, Mattis guarantees the steadiness of NATO, but the Europeans must chip in much more, which they should. So I think if we look at the European picture here, the Europeans are sort of nervously looking to Washington. What do they demand? What will he demand? When do I get the letter? But one should instead say, we must manage ourselves, because this is not about Article 5, essentially. Unlikely to be about Article 5 unless something goes very wrong by miscalculation. One should define interests. One should look at for partners. One should define strategic interests. But there is nothing of that. And I must say, although I've always been a pro-European, pro-EU person, always fond of the EU, it is incredible what the EU can produce and call as strategic documents. If you look at the global strategy, there's nothing strategic about it. It's all sort of a rhetoric of goodwill. We will do all these wonderful things in the world, but there's nothing about ways, ends, and means. And PESCO is about spending more wisely. It's not about a supranational European army. So there is a lot the Europeans, I think, based very much on major powers, should develop together. And by contrast, if we look at what the Russians have achieved by the use of military force, essentially, it is quite impressive. I don't condone it, but I study it and I see that this is happening. This is a fait accompli. The sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, cases Crimea, Ukraine, and Georgia, is well established. I don't think NATO now will think about inviting Ukraine and Georgia to become members. I don't know what will happen in Serbia, the Balkans. I was just in Serbia, as I said, where we have relatives in Vojvodina, and they were very nervous about which way will Serbia take? Is it possible to go the EU route? And I don't think so. I don't think Serbia is headed in that direction. So the whole Balkan, will the Balkans join the EU and maybe NATO? We all know what happened when Montenegro joined NATO. It was a close call. It was an attempt to stop that. Syria, Russia is the key actor, the key non-Middle East actor in Syria, dealing with Erdogan, Erdogan's interest in anti-Kurdistan, Russia's interest in foiling up NATO by NATO ally, Erdogan as an ally. It's quite amazing, the NATO ally, Erdogan or Turkey, buying Russia anti-air weaponry and being an ally of Putin. And so it goes. So we see that there is no Western influence in the Middle East apart from the US, Israel, and some French and British bases and connections. So in a way, does Europe have any ability to stabilize, to contain, to influence, to shape the neighborhood the neighborhood is Russia, Caucasus, Middle East, and the Maghreb. And of course, mass migration, which is extremely well organized as a business, is bound to continue unless it is stopped by a combination of aid and coercion. So, I mean, this is the Europeans have serious strategic challenges that are not really yet addressed by the Europeans together. And the worst case, of course, is that there is much more of, with Trump being so unreliable, so short-tempered, sort of absolutely impertinent in how he deals with people. There's every reason to believe that there will be shouting, Twitter shouts across the Atlantic. And the Europeans should do well then to say we will manage, we will cooperate with the US, but we will not be so dependent on the US. And we could have this sort of, some will do defense in the EU. If that irritates the Americans, they will, unless Mattis decides, there may be much more of this sort of Trump reaction that if you're not with us, if you're not paying up, if you prefer the EU for a defense structure, well, go ahead. It's your doing. And we could have a sort of division in Europe between the continent on the one hand and the Northern Europeans centering on London. The axis, Washington, London, Oslo, Denmark, Northern Europe sort of drifting away from continental Europe. But as I didn't say, but as you all know, there are two nuclear states in Europe, and a realist predicted that Germany would soon get nuclear weapons back in 1990. That hasn't happened, and I don't think it's likely to happen. But if you think about it in maybe a longer term, if Europe is forced to think seriously about defending itself and through deterrence, maybe the nuclear discussion will get going. Not in Germany alone, I don't think so, but it is clear that tactical nuclear weapons, missile technology, this is what it's about in Europe. It is not so much about number of soldiers anymore. So I think what Europeans lack is strategic plans, strategic analysis, more than this sort of every nation spending 2%. It's just a goal, which is, in a way, a convenient goal that one has stipulated. It's a small percentage, by the way, compared to other major states. So one should reach the 2%, but that's not enough. One should have a strategy for what one wants to deter, what one wants to coerce, what one wants to shape of the security environment in Europe. Thank you so far. I think this was a terrible sort of dosis, eine grausame Salbe am Ende des Tages.
Thank you very much
Vielen Dank für diesen großartigen Vortrag über strategische Führung, Professor Matlary. Sie haben gesagt, dass Führung aus Kompetenz besteht. Sie haben erwähnt, dass der Ratschlag der USA sehr nett für Europa ist. Auch die strategischen Optionen der Abschreckung haben Sie erwähnt, gegenüber Russland in Osteuropa. Auch Georgien haben Sie erwähnt, die 3 Ks, Kola, Kaliningrad und die Krim, sehr wichtig für Russland, alle 3. Und Sie haben eine sehr gute Analyse der europäischen Situation gegeben. Und das schlimmste Szenario ist ziemlich dunkel, wie Sie erwähnt haben. Wie wir gesehen haben, wie wir schon bei den anderen Rednern gesehen haben, werden wir 3 Fragen erlauben. Wir haben hier schon eine. Vielen Dank. Gratuliere. Ich bin aus dem Kongo. Ich habe 2 Fragen, die Afrika betreffen. Wie Sie haben gesagt, dass Frankreich in seiner Strategie nicht vorbereitet war. Da kann ich Ihnen nicht ganz zustimmen. Ich gebe Ihnen 2 Beispiele dazu. 1994 hatte Frankreich eine sogenannte Operation bei uns. Aber was damals passierte, dass nach der Präsident Burundis getötet worden war, hatten wir am Tag danach die Reaktion. Die französische Armee war da. Das ist ein Beispiel, wie schnell sie reagieren können. Unter der Präsidentschaft von Präsident, ich vergesse jetzt seinen Namen, vor Hollande, das war Sarkozy, vielen Dank. Was damals nicht funktionierte, Frankreich war immer gut vorbereitet, aber nachdem Gaddafi getötet worden war, gab es dann eine sehr schnelle Reaktion. Sie können mir also jetzt nicht sagen, dass Frankreich immer hinten nach ist. Für mich stimmt das einfach nicht. Sie haben recht. Ich sagte nicht, dass Frankreich immer hinten nach ist. Ich sage, sie haben eine strategische Kultur und vielleicht fehlt die in anderen Ländern mehr. Die französische Führung in Mali zum Beispiel und in der Sahel, Bakan auch, sind... Was?
Englisch. That is English.
Aber wieso?
But of course, French Africa policy has a long and very, should one say, checkered history many times. It's enough to read Le Monde. If you read Le Monde, you get a lot of information about Africa that exists nowhere else. There's no other state that follows African politics, and that is so involved. And of course, I agree that Rwanda, there was simply no willingness to stop the genocide in Rwanda, neither from the Belgians, nor the French, nor anybody else. And the UN had all the information from Romeo Dallaire, who was then leading the little contingent, the UN force, and he asked for 3,000 combat soldiers, and he got none. So the French and the Belgians extracted their nationals and left. So this is the biggest shame after Srebrenica, those two, Srebrenica and Rwanda, in UN history, but also for various countries. Nobody wanted to help stop the genocide. And of course that has to be, to take the risk in man-to-man combat. There would have been many casualties, of course. Libya, that is also true. Sarkozy was spurred on by Bernard-Henri Lévy, the one with the nice hairdo, you know, the French philosopher, who always is careful about having colored his hair properly, I guess. BHL, as he's called, he brought the Benghazi so-called government up to Paris, and Sarkozy I think he wanted to play a leading role and strategically to turn France away from supporting the dictators of old in the Maghreb, because Ben Ali was toppled, and with him the French foreign minister who had to leave her post, and Mubarak was also supported also by the Americans, by Obama, quite for too long. You know, in diplomacy, you stay with the old dictator until you know he's going, and then you switch allegiance. So I think for Sarkozy, this was a chance to show we support the new democratic forces in the Arab Spring. And then, of course, it ended in a regime change. So this is one of the absolute absurdities in terms of war history. And Norway chipped in and did as many bombing sorties as did the French and the British, along with Denmark, which is even more of a mystery. But it was a long answer.
Yeah. Next question, please, General Miloblat.
What does it help if we analyze what has happened in the past? We must see the way ahead, European army and so forth and so forth. And where do you see the locomotive for that? Isn't it so that, for example, a very close cooperation between Germany and France could set a process in motion that could really result in what we need in the future in the European army? Could I have your thoughts on that?
Yes, I would hope that the answer to that is yes. And I think, I mean, Germany is a framework nation in NATO, and that's a very important job. But when you look at in the French Revue Stratégique, the French emphasize risk willingness, war fighting ability, not only capability. Who will go to sort of fight in Africa with us, as the British also said in Afghanistan, who will fight in Helmand with us. So it's really a question of German military culture. Is one willing to be much more risk willing? Because the French, there was a report on the Mali operation written by RAND Corporation, and it said, we Americans, we are always carrying so much gear, protective gear. We take too little risk. The French go with much less equipment, take much more risk, and get results. And this is also what the British do. Maybe because they have long colonial warfare experiences. And of course, in terms of deterrence, if you're going to deter somebody, it's not enough to have so many brigades and so on. This opponent must really be afraid of you, that you are willing to fight and win. And I think this is this X factor in Europe that, are we willing to be tough and brutal against those who are tough and brutal? And it's not politically correct. And we saw in Afghanistan, in ISAF, the rules of engagement were just tremendously different from state to state. And that was, of course, with national red card holders and national contributions. But it was really who is staying out of risky situations and who take risk. There was, I think there were so many caveats that one could count to 180. So this ISAF really showed the differences in NATO. So I think there are so many paper tigers in these force registers. I wrote a book about the first EU, the Tony Blair, Jacques Chirac, the battle groups. And that, of course, was sort of the Europeans are getting autonomous military capacity, rapid reaction forces. And the battle groups have been used twice, basically, and they are still on rotation. And it's 12 years since they were used. And this has to do with political unwillingness. But unless you know that the rapid reaction force will be there, it has no function, and it certainly cannot deter. So if there is risk willingness and war fighting willingness, then it's serious. Then the French will be very happy because they have that. And they would like the EU to have that capability, which goes back to de Gaulle. And the French are, of course, they will want the British to be present, but the engine in the EU is, of course, German, French in all other matters. Thank you.
Yeah. Last question is, yes, please.
He is going to speak in Norwegian. He speaks Norwegian. Yes, of course, I will understand you. So.
Faktisk vi alle skremt nå etter deres foredrag. Ja. Fordi amerikanerne, ja, de redd russerne, ja, og pusher de ut. Ja. Russerne skremt av hele Vesten etter erfaringer som de hadde samlet over mange felttog for. Ja. Og vi europeerne, vi kjenner oss faktisk sandwiched.
Well, I don't think he says we are all scared after your speech because we are sandwiched in Europe between the Americans and the Russians. No, I think what the Americans will rightly expect is the Europeans to take responsibility for their own security to a much greater extent, to deal with sub-Article 5 situations, which is fully possible. And Article 5 situations will not be wanted by neither Russia nor anybody else. The US conventional and nuclear forces are so dominant in the world that they are really world sort of policemen still. There is no rivalry of that. So I think if the Europeans are wise now and do their part in NATO, Trump is satisfied, and there can be a sort of harmonious. At least NATO will continue like before, but it's my own country. We spend too little on defense. We are now scrapping the tanks we have, the Leopard 2A. They're 40 years old. They should be renewed. There is no willingness from a conservative government even to spend on defense because it's too unpleasant. Who wants to hear about this? Which voters are interested, etc., etc. So when a conservative government in a country next to the Kola basis is so unwilling, then it says a lot about the mindset of Europeans who have no remembrance of the Cold War and no knowledge of Second World War. Because this is, this generation has no notion of what went on. Yes?
Thank you very much.
No,
thank you very much. I may thank you with the Strategos Rubicatus. It's the red wine from the National Defense Academy.
This is something all NATO countries should make wine in their staff colleges.
Dear Professor, I say a big thank you.
Yeah.
I didn't promise too much. I hope it was enthusing, it was informative, it was all the things we should learn from history, from strategy. It is a big lecture for Europe, and I'm very grateful you did this big and tremendously good job for us. Thank you very much, Professor. Weiter im Programm.
We're going to proceed in the program. We are going to if we are not going to take a 5-minute break now, I think we're going to do a very brief leg stretch, and just as briefly as possible, Dr. Radke has about 30-minute time to talk all the way to 1950, and then we are going to quickly go on to the icebreaker after a short welcome. So we want to be back in time so that Dr. Radke gets his 30 to 35 minutes on the energy situation. Thank you very much.